Good afternoon. Hello. Everyone hear me okay? Perfect. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you here in this room and online. I think we have 45 maybe online participants to this Betty Shammai lecture, to the Department of American Culture's annual Betty Shammai lecture. My name is Ritika Adhikari. I'm an assistant professor in the American Culture Department and in the program of Asian Pacific Islander American Studies, and also this year's faculty coordinator for the Betty Shammai lecture. Before we get started with today's event, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Michigan resides on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fire Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Wyandot Nation. In particular, the university resides on lands gifted by the three nations and the Wyandot Nation in the 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs. We acknowledge the language of gift in the original treaty entails mutual relationships between treaty parties, respect, and obligation on the part of the settlers. We advocate for Indigenous struggles against ongoing settler colonialism and strive for a decolonized future. And now moving on to today's event. This annual lecture was established in 2019 to honor the legacy of Betty Shammai with generous in 2019, with generous support from the Shammai family. Dr. Shammai received the very first PhD in American culture in 1961 at U of M. She continued her career researching American literature and music, founding the Radical Caucus of the American Studies Association, and working to challenge systemic gender discrimination in American studies programs. In addition to the generous support from the Shammai family, this event has been made possible by the contributions from our co-sponsors, which include the Department of Anthropology, the Latino-Latina Studies Program, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures, and the Office of Multi-Ethnic Student Affairs. Because of the co-sponsorship, we're able to have both this lecture and a reception that will follow immediately after, just outside. This event also would not have been possible without the dedicated support of AC staff, and in particular, Yota, our AC Events and Communications Coordinator. Let's give a round of applause to our staff. Thank you so much, Yota. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Jason de León, this year's distinguished speaker. Jason is a professor of anthropology, Chicano Studies, and Central American Studies at UCLA, where he's also the director of the Kotzen Institute of Archaeology. His award-winning first book, The Land of Open Graves, Living and Dying on the Migrant Trail, provides a powerful critique of the US border enforcement policy that forces migrants to cross through the brutal terrain of the Sonoran Desert, putting them at high risk of death. His second book, which just came out 2 weeks ago, is Soldiers and Kings, Survival and Hope in the World of Human Smuggling. The book is a deep ethnographic examination of the daily lives of Honduran smugglers moving migrants across Mexico. Jason is also the executive director of the Undocumented Migration Project, a research, arts, and education collective that raises awareness about migration issues globally and assists families of missing migrants to be reunited with their loved ones. A 2017 MacArthur Fellow, Jason's robust scholarship on clandestine migration, as well as an active public humanities profile, is exemplary. I'd like to add that Jason's scholarship, which is already groundbreaking conceptually, methodologically, and in its blurring of academic and public scholarship boundaries, is a reminder of the power of storytelling. It is through his compassionate writing that his books shed light on the complicated ways that people exist, navigate, and try to survive the terror of the contemporary border regime. In the introduction of Soldiers and Kings, Jason writes, and I quote, "Let's be clear. I'm not trying to humanize anyone. Instead, I begin this book with a seemingly radical proposition that those who try to make a living guiding people across hardening geopolitical boundaries are themselves human," end quote. Jason continuously foregrounds the simple yet radical idea through his rigorous research and disarmingly honest writing. On a personal note, I've been teaching Jason's work for nearly a decade, beginning from when I was a graduate student. It is almost a ritual now when I teach chapters from The Land of Open Graves. Students, unprompted, express how much they want to keep reading the entire book, some going out of their way to buy the book in order to follow the journey of his interlocutors, Lucio and Memo. Having our students, and let's be honest, ourselves, read an academic study cover to cover is a major feat. But Jason's scholarship repeatedly accomplishes this mighty task. We are so thrilled to have you back in Ann Arbor, Jason. And now please join me in welcoming Professor Jason de León.
Thank you so much for that very overly generous introduction and for the invitation in general. I think I just want to begin by thanking everyone for this wonderful invitation, for having me back despite the fact that I left. And you know, what I'm going to talk about today really happened. This project started when I was here at the University of Michigan, and one of my former students who was there in the field that first year is here. So it's just a really kind of wonderful full circle moment for me a bit. And I also just want to say, you know, I haven't given a book talk. I've never given this talk, and partly because I've been avoiding talking about this project for a long time because it has been so challenging, personally, emotionally, as well as intellectually. And so I couldn't have asked for a room full of so many familiar faces. So if I fall flat on my face, I know there are people here who like me and who will be nice to me and tell me that everything was fine. But I'm excited to, you know, this is the first of 3 talks I have this week. And so it's great to kind of road test some of this material here. Anywho, so thank you so much for having me back, Michigan. Okay. Roberto's murder doesn't warrant much attention. And this is not surprising in a place like Honduras, where homicide has become woven into the fabric of daily life. Still, a local newspaper manages to give him 3 sentences, although they get his first name wrong. They say Jose Roberto Paredes, his real name is Juan Roberto Paredes, died Friday night at Mario Rivas Hospital. Family members reported that he had tried to travel mojado illegally to the United States, but in Chiapas, Mexico, was stabbed during an assault and admitted to a hospital. After his discharge, he returned to Honduras, and a few days later, his condition worsened. He was brought back to Rivas Hospital, where he died after several days. This story in the local paper gets most of the basic details right. Roberto was in Mexico illegally when he was stabbed, and he did later die in Honduras from those wounds. But he wasn't a migrant headed to the United States, at least not anymore. He'd given up that fantasy a while ago. And for the past few years, he'd been living as a street urchin in Mexico, making a little money guiding his fellow Hondurans on the train tracks as they made their way north toward the American dream. What he did for a modest living goes by many names in English and in Spanish. Coyote, pollero, pasador, interchangeable terms that refer to a person who is paid to get someone across a geopolitical boundary while avoiding detection by immigration agents. Roberto, like many others in his situation, preferred to call himself a guia, a guide, a designation with potentially less semantic baggage, and one that perhaps more directly reflects the work. He is the one you follow the one who could potentially lead you through danger. The one thing you cannot call Roberto is a human trafficker. People who are trafficked have that happen against their will, usually through force, fraud, or coercion. Those people that Roberto smuggled were willing participants who actively sought him out and paid for his services. I'm going to say it again. Human smuggler and trafficker are very different things. And this seems to be a concept that our popular media repeatedly fails to understand. Now, you only have to turn on the news for a little bit to get to the point that we are living in a worldwide migration crisis, where poverty, violence, political instability, climate change, all of these terrible things are forcing millions each year to leave their homes in search of a better existence. Given the rate that this inequality is growing, coupled with things like rising sea levels, increased drought, and the appearance of environmental monsters like super hurricanes, you don't have to be a soothsayer to predict that things are about to get a lot worse for all of humanity. And the response of the global north has been increasingly to harden its borders. And we're going to hear more and more about this year in this election cycle. Harden our borders and pour money into migrant detention and deportation industrial complexes. Build barricades, fire tear gas and rubber bullets at mothers holding their babies. Put children in cages. Deny due process to asylum seekers. This seems to be the American way. But history has shown us that these border walls are no match for human determination and the will to live. As an anthropologist, I can assuredly tell you that our species' survival has long been related to our ability to move across the landscape in search of resources and new habitats. Human mobility cannot be stopped. The human spirit cannot be broken. And as countries like the US and now increasingly places like Mexico attempt to beat back migrants from their front doors, like a scene from P.D. James's novel and the Alfonso Cuarón film, The Children of Men, as we do this, the human smuggling industry has ballooned. And sneaking people past border guards has grown from a mom and pop business into a billion-dollar global industry. And I promise you, this is only going to become more important as parts of our planet become less and less livable. And as we ramp up this security, migrants now need a new breed of smuggler, someone who can provide safe passage through the increasingly violent world of clandestine movement. This means hiring someone who can do brutal things to get paying clients through a deadly gauntlet that spans multiple countries. This is a gauntlet characterized by extreme environments and transnational gangs, drug cartels, and law enforcement looking to impede and or profit from the journey of these individuals. And so these days, these low-level smugglers doing this dirty work have a lot in common with their clients. The smugglers themselves are also trying to escape poverty and the now unlivable places that they once call home. Roberto, the guia, he was a tiny little cog in the behemoth economy of human smuggling. The media often portrays him as bad guys who prey on the innocent. I wish that story was that simple, but it's not. Arrest and deportation by law enforcement, robbery, kidnapping, extortion, murder at the hands of transnational organizations. These are the things that migrants are increasingly facing. And many have come to see people like Roberto as necessary and sometimes life-saving. This isn't to say that smugglers cannot be thieves, traffickers, murderers, and or rapists. They can potentially be all those things and then some. And as unfolds today and as what unfolds in the book, a point that I try to make is that there's a lot of diversity within this whole thing, and nothing is ever as clear-cut as we want it to be. And keep this in mind. People contract smugglers because they give them the benefit of the doubt that no matter what happens, maybe they're going to spend more money, they're going to get ripped off, but they'll at least get to their final destination. All migrants have heard stories of evil smugglers who abuse our clients, and a great many of them have had their own terrible firsthand experiences. But still, migrants are making these social contracts with these folks in good faith, in the hope that they will be protectors and not rob them, sell them into slavery, or abandon them in the jungle, the desert, or the back of a semi-truck. And there are just enough good smugglers in the economy of clandestine movement for this thing to keep functioning. even with the constant risk of things taking a bad turn at some point on the journey. In Western popular media, when we hear about smugglers, we often kind of imagine these pot-bellied Latinos with silver-capped teeth and slick-back hair. They reek of cologne and they drive fancy trucks bought with the hard-earned or often borrowed money of desperate people trying to get to La USA. Roberto defied these stereotypes. He was a skinny, banged-up Honduran kid who was often homeless and living hand to mouth. He rarely had more than $20 to his name and was often more desperate than his clients. He knew how to guide people along the train tracks and through the jungles because he came of age in those terrible, terrible places. But he never saw huge piles of money. He never got to drive a car. He was not a kingpin or someone who called the shots. There's nothing glamorous about his lifestyle or his brutally short existence. Roberto's modest grave is marked by a wrought iron plaque that bears his name, his birthday, and his date of death. Somehow the engraver managed to get his last day on Earth incorrect. But many people would say that it doesn't really matter. To most, Roberto is a nobody, just another young man from Honduras with a history of substance abuse and violent behavior. He was someone destined for an early grave, and cemeteries across Central America are full of the skeletons of people just like him. Children born into generational poverty, whose bleak futures are predetermined before they can even speak. Kids who live fast and die fast because those are often the only choices they are given. Roberto is one of those kids, but he's not a nobody. He's a young person with dreams and aspirations who carries hope with him until the very end. He is important enough that people will wail at his funeral and pray for his soul. Someone will scratch "I love you" in the wet concrete that is poured over the top of his tomb. I will come to know Roberto as a soldier trying to survive on the train tracks in Mexico. He confides in me that he wants out of the smuggling game. It's gotten out of control. Death is breathing down his neck. He wants to run far away and reinvent a life for himself that doesn't include guns or knives or desperate people doing desperate things. He asks me for help to escape his nightmare. I will have my chance to save him, but I will fail and he will die. The train tracks will take his life, and I will forever carry guilt for the things I didn't do. As I sit on his grave in rural Honduras, I ponder the surrounding lush countryside. It's an awe-inspiring landscape that holds no future for so many people who must head north and roll the dice. Migrants who will follow the train tracks across Mexico and pray that whatever is waiting for them at the end of the line is better than the cruel hardships and early death they are running from in Honduras. This project, this book, is about Roberto and others like him who get caught up in the smuggling game. People on the train tracks who go by 1,000 nicknames: Kingston, Flaco, Alma, Papo, Chino, Santos. People whose birth names are often mysteries until the very end when they are inscribed onto tombstones. In Soldiers and Kings, I explore the lives of smugglers and their intimate relationships with death. Destitute men and women who find themselves trapped in a world of violence and fast money while in search of hope. A world of guias who have no one to lead them to safety except maybe themselves. This talk is a brief and, I will admit, an unsatisfactory journey down those train tracks as I try to say something in 50 minutes, pull some messages or ideas from 400 pages of text and almost 10 years of research. But let's try it. As was mentioned, the work that I'm talking about today comes from the Undocumented Migration Project, which is the nonprofit that research arts collective that I direct and draw on a whole range of research approaches and various kinds of things I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A about the exhibition work or about our work with families of missing migrants. But it's part of a much larger project that I've been directing since 2009. The book that I'm talking about today is a trade book. which means it's written for a popular audience, and I don't have a lot of impenetrable theoretical points to make, other than maybe making a case for how anthropology can help us understand the complexities of our world, and also helping us to understand the relationship between smuggling, border enforcement practices, capitalism, climate change, and all that other stuff. The book really is about 6 individuals whose stories are interwoven together and come in and out of focus at different times. And so there are moments where we're in the current moment. There's other times where we're getting the backstory of some of these folks, but trying to tie them all together into one giant narrative. And I think, you know, after I finished the book, another thing that I kind of came to understand was that it ended up really being about the difficulties of ethnography for me as an individual, like the difficult practice of ethnography. And I really try to talk about my struggles with it as a method, and also how to write about the experiences of others. And you know, and I think in some ways, when I look back at the book, it does feel a bit like a manual for either how to do field work or how to not do field work. But it's a lot of, you know, I air a lot of my dirty laundry in this book, and you know, and trying to explain to the general public what an anthropologist is. You know, we throw this term around within our own discipline, this idea of the deep hangout, which the New York Times just thought was really funny and wasn't meant to be funny. Was trying to say, like, you know, this idea of deep hanging out. It's this long-term commitment to understanding someone else's experience by spending as much time as we possibly can in those scenarios. You know, with no timeline, with no pressing timeline, you know, deadline to kind of make, but you know, how long can we commit ourselves to this practice in order to do right by our interlocutors? So a big chunk of the book is about this practice. And you know, before I kind of get into it, I just want to say, you know, why study smuggling? Part of it for me was my first book. You know, smugglers were kind of the elephant in the room that no one ever really, that I never talked about, or not in very detailed ways, despite the fact that these are crucial players in this whole process. And so this book is really meant to be the opposite end of this coin, to see kind of what this social process kind of looks like. And just the fact that we know so little about the smuggling industry, despite the fact that it is crucial to this global billion-dollar industry. And as you'll see in a minute, it's not an easy nut to crack. But trying to write about smugglers has really forced me to think differently about this whole process, and to try to, I don't know, I think in a lot of ways it really kept me honest about what was happening, and my own sort of feelings about this whole process, because it's a very murky and ethically troubling thing to try to write about, or just be even in the room with. And like I said, one more time, is not the same as human trafficking. And this, for some reason, is just I repeat it because if you take nothing else from this talk, it's that kind of plain fact. When I began this work in 2015, it was on the cusp of major changes that were happening in Mexico, related to this program called Plan Frontera Sur, which was essentially just Mexico's new version of trying to keep Central Americans out at the behest of the United States government. They sort of framed it as, we are trying to protect the human rights of Central American migrants crossing our country, through arresting them and deporting them in high numbers. Much like the policy of prevention through deterrence, which is the primary way in which we police our current border at the moment, we never hear that phrase. You've never heard Biden say it out loud, or Trump, or Obama, or even Bush, despite the fact that prevention through deterrence is how we weaponize the desert, we weaponize the South Texas backwoods against migrants, through this policy, but we never say it out loud. Plan Frontera Sur is the same thing. We are Mexico with lots of help from the U.S. is doing their very best to deter migrants from crossing that country, but nobody there wants to say it out loud. And I remember I gave a talk in Mexico City in 2018 or 2019, and I had a Mexican official say to me, "No existe. Plan Frontera Sur no longer exists." And I say, well, when I walk around, I see lots of detention buses, and you're building all these new fancy facilities to arrest people. But just because you don't admit that that's what's going on doesn't mean that it's not happening. And of course, so when I began this project, this policy is in place. And one of the things that became really clear was that there were lots of human rights abuses that were happening at the hands of Mexican immigration agents, which I talk about in the beginning of the book. And the smugglers that I worked with loved it because, of course, then it just makes more money for them. The more you harden the border, the more money the smugglers will make, and the more need there becomes for them. And so that was sort of the backdrop when this project began. And a big chunk of it started in southern Mexico, in Chiapas, in a little village called Pacalná, which is on the outskirts of the town of Palenque, most famous for its archaeological site of the same name. But at this point in 2015, they were really trying to move the U.S.-Mexico border down to the Guatemala-Chiapas border and prevent migrants from getting up there. And so I began the project there, spent lots of time going back and forth, but really ended up being all across Mexico. I spent a lot of time in Mexico City, in Veracruz, but also a lot of time in Honduras as the folks that I was working with were moving back and forth. So that's kind of the backdrop. And now I want to just introduce you to some of these folks. And so let's meet Chino. The lead engine lurches 50 feet forward, it stops, it reverses, and slams into the car behind it. Grinding metal and screeching engine brakes are competing with roosters and tropical birds, and now we are in southern Mexico in the jungles of Chiapas. The train heaves forward once again, reverses and slams backwards, and keeps repeating the process, adding more and more rail cars each time. Chino is 15 feet above us, stoned out of his mind and giggling as he leaps from one moving car to another. He's a third world Peter Pan in knockoff Crocs, dancing for an audience of locals, migrants, and myself. He's hamming it up, waving and grinning and sprinting across these cars in a matter of seconds. He stops at the edge of the lean car, doubles back, and keeps going back and forth. Thinks it's funny. I think his forward momentum is going to end up being too much and will send him flying when he tries to put on the brakes. It's a dangerous, stupid, and entertainingly juvenile game that allows him to show off for the crowd and remind the migrants that are looking for his services that he is crazy and will do anything needed to get them where they need to go. I remember myself at this age doing equally dangerous and irresponsible things to entertain my friends. Dangling from a third-story roof, drunk and high on Vicodin, putting a half stick of dynamite into my mouth and accidentally lighting the fuse while pretending it's a cigar. I remember pushing a 500-pound dumpster down a steep hill and then running in front of it to recreate a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. In college, I never drunkenly ran across the top of a moving train. This is probably because I didn't have access to a train. On the surface, my shenanigans were mischievous at best and irresponsibly dangerous at worst. I thought of my behavior as simply the kind of jackass things that young people do for kicks. Shit to make people laugh, which they often did. Deep down, though, I was trying to fill a hollowness that lived inside of me, a darkness that manifested itself in bouts of crippling depression, intense feelings of isolation and rage, and a playful death wish that loomed over my teenage years and my early 20s. People have asked me repeatedly how I can spend so much time with smugglers whose lives are dominated by risk and creeping demise. It's partly because it feels strangely familiar. I don't know what it's like to rob or kill someone, but I know what it's like to want to live fast and die. For many years, it felt like the hints of death that I would construct for myself were the only things that made me feel alive. This is probably one of the reasons that I get along so well with Chino. We are long lost kin bonded by childhood trauma and long histories of dangerous self-medicating and self-harm. I see something of my adolescent self in his youthful recklessness, in his embrace of a life where death is something to be taunted and almost welcomed. The death wish that I had to overcome and my own lifelong struggles with complex PTSD seemed to give me some privileged insight into Chino's worldview, as well as the many other men that I meet in the world of smuggling. Which was something I had to realize in the middle of this whole work. It's like, why am I here? And then it was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it was a journey of self-discovery in many ways for me during the writing process and trying to make sense of why I was in this space and what the gravitational pull was. As I watch him foolishly play on top of a train, I think about a cynical line from Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. Addie, the matriarch of the Bundren family, says, "The reason for living was to get ready to stay dead for a long time." What if the reason for dying is to know that you were once alive? It takes some coaxing, but he finally comes off the top of that train, and we sit underneath a palapa and pretend that the heat isn't smothering us. He grabs a stick and starts painting a picture for me in the dirt, rattling off these names. Tapachula, Benemérito, Palenque, Corozal, Ixtepec, Tierra Blanca, Tenosique, Lecheria, Salto de Agua, Coatzacoalcos. This uneducated young man has an advanced degree in Mexican geography. Places to avoid, places where a church might open its doors, places where teenagers with machetes and no patience collect $100 head taxes. Survival here is a knowledge game with a steep learning curve. Chino speaks of a violent world of cycles with no viable end in sight. He says to me, he says, "Man, I spent a lot of time on the train coming and going, coming and going. Sometimes they grab you at a checkpoint," he says, "and then they send you back to Honduras. You try again, and they catch you again. Then you know about that place, so you don't go there anymore. You try a different route, and you go around those places. It's simple. Immigration gets tougher, and we invent new routes." He says, "I've tried to cross Mexico 5 times. I got as far as Laredo, Texas." He says, "There I ended up living in a tree. I found some plywood and I climbed up into a tree with it. I made a bed and had some branches and I tied my backpack up there. It was in my little house," he says. "I would be up there smoking cigarettes at night." He says, "I spent 8 days sleeping in a fucking tree." He says, "Immigration would come through looking for me, but they couldn't see me. They couldn't see Chino," he says. He loves to talk about himself in the third person. He says, they couldn't see Chino. And then they caught Chino coming out of a 7-Eleven, he says. "I told them I was going home, but they knew I was undocumented because of how I spoke." I also would say, "Chino, like, you're constantly wearing like a shirt with like the Honduran flag on it. You've got a Honduran belt buckle. You've got a tattoo on your arm that says catracho, which is a Honduran slang for Honduran." So I said, "Well, how long were you in the States for?" He says, "I was there for a month." He says, "But the problem is that you get there and then what?" He's like, I had no place to go. I end up on the streets." I said, how old were you the first time you came to Mexico?" He says, "I was 16 that first time I tried to cross. I got as far as Arriaga in Chiapas, and they caught me. Told them I was Guatemalan, so they sent me there, and then I tried again." I said, "Why did you end up coming in the first place?" He says, "I couldn't really go to school or stay with my family because of economic problems. There were so many of us in our house, and only my mom worked. I had to work too. Finally, I said, 'Mama, you brought me into this world, so thank you. But I don't want to be another headache for you because you have enough of those.' So I left. I had a friend who said, 'Hey, it's really good over here in Mexico. Let's do it. Let's go.' But in reality," he says, "it's really fucking hard here. There's immigration constantly looking for you, and being undocumented means you can't get a job. You go and look for work here in Mexico, and people don't want to give you a job because you're Honduran." He continues to sketch out this map in the dirt. It shows the border with Guatemala to the south and Mexico City and Laredo to the north. His map covers thousands of square miles. Chino knows dozens of cities, towns, and villages, but his view of them is tethered to the train tracks. He never sees all that these places have to offer. It's like he's looking at the world through storefront windows. Santos. The Sonoran Desert is disorienting and merciless. Santos thinks that they're headed in the right direction, but only because he puts faith in the Mexican who's leading this train of drug mules. Days into this exhausting journey, he's questioning his decision to come. Still, carrying drugs on his back will cover his border crossing fees all the way to Phoenix. Alone, he could never come up with the $5,000 to pay a coyote. He's suspicious, though, of this group, but he knows the drill. This is because at 18 years old, he already has years of experience guiding migrants through the jungles of southern Mexico while trying to avoid immigration officials. He didn't set out to be a drug mule, but he finds himself out in the desert, putting one sluggish foot in front of the other, while quietly praying for a future that doesn't involve doing this type of work. His daydream is shattered by the pathetic voice of a young kid, the only other Honduran in his group, a kid who falls to the ground. "Give me 5 minutes," the kid begs. "Fuck you, hurry up," the guide says. The knife that the guide pulls out is chipped and rust-stained with craggy teeth, like a child's drawing of a monster. "You get up now, or you're going to get 2 puñalazos, and then I'll leave you here to die." "Leave him alone," Santos commands. "Why do you care?" the guide asks. "If you're going to do this shit to him, how do I know you won't do it to me too?" Santos unties the ropes cinched around his shoulders and chest and drops 55 pounds of hard-packed marijuana onto the ground. The kid starts vomiting foam. "Let's go," someone yells. "Look at him. He can't walk," Santos explains. The guide says, "If I get caught, I will find you in Mexico and I will kill you." "Kill whoever you want," he responds, "but I'm staying here." "Please don't leave me," the kid begs. After more arguing, the guide finally relents and tells everyone to hide their packs. These men lie beneath gnarled mesquite trees that offer little respite from the violent midday sun. They contemplate their futures in a desert where thousands have died since the 1994 implementation of the border enforcement strategy known as prevention through deterrence, a strategy that purposely uses the environment as a weapon against migrants. In Arizona alone, more than 4,151 sets of remains have been found since the late 90s. The kid starts sipping water and tries to slow his pounding chest. His skin is cold and he wonders how he can be freezing in this heat. Around him, men in camouflage clothes are scattered about in similar positions of uneasy repose. For hours, they chase shade, pretending that an escape from the heat is possible. "You saved my life," the kid tells Santos. "They were going to kill me." Santos thinks about his own mother and imagines how she would feel if he never walked out of this desert. The sky blackens and night brings on a temporary sense of stillness. One of the Mexicans passes Santos a cigarette and looks away as he speaks into the coming night. "You don't have what it takes to be a guide out here." "Why is that?" Santos asks. "You're too soft. This job requires that you do bad things. People die out here. If you don't threaten them, they won't keep going." Santos opens his mouth and releases a cloud of dry smoke into the Sonoran desert air. "I think you're right," he says. "I'm not built for this." In a tiny Honduran village, a child watches the body of his father being lowered into a void of dark soil. 2 years later, that child, barely 13 now, walks out of the village and never looks back. Juvenile and malnourished, Santos enters a surreal world in Mexico built on violence. Rail yards inhabited by soot-faced men crazed with drink and sex. Jungles dense with animals of all species, including predators armed with machetes, and the rejection of mercy that comes from having no witnesses. This child memorizes this perverse landscape while trying not to let it devour him. He begs, borrows, and steals to stay alive. Santos comes of age alone with increasingly vague notions of what home is and what it means to live. By the time he approaches the gangsters who control the Mexican train tracks asking for work, he's already a hardened soldier who can follow orders. And it's funny, when I loaded this picture into PowerPoint, AI gives you tries to describe what's going on. This was described as men working on the train tracks, which I thought was interesting. By the time he asks for work, he's been out there for years, and he knows what it's like being a failed migrant. He's failed to get to the US many times. The gangsters give him instructions and a handful of people and say, get them to Celaya. Someone will be waiting for you. This feels like a job he's been training for his whole life. He helps his clients onto a train somewhere in the jungles of Chiapas, and 7 days later, his people are tired and hungry, but they're safely in Celaya. They pile into a vehicle and someone hands him $400. In the years to come, he will make many drop-offs across Mexico, and this work will become steady enough for him to save up some cash before deciding he's had enough and will head north again toward Arizona. He will try to pay for his passage this time by crossing through the desert. He ends up in Arizona for months, enjoying the good life, until one day, he and his boss are driving to a job and change lanes without using a turn signal, are pulled over by the Border Patrol, and he is quickly finds himself handcuffed and on a plane flying back to Honduras. He returns to his village after so many years of being away, and now, like many places in Honduras, MS-13 rules the neighborhood with impunity. They offer him a job extorting money from friends, neighbors, and family, and he refuses. The gang gives him an ultimatum: join us, leave, or die. He has spent his youth trying to avoid gang life, and he knows it's a dead end. So once again, he escapes from home, and he is soon back in Mexico, escorting migrants through a maze of dangers. Jessamine. In her pink Heartbreaker t-shirt and her quiet way, Jessamine seems out of place among this company of petty smugglers and low-budget hustlers on the train tracks in Pakalna. Barely 20 years old and barely 5'2", she doesn't intimidate, but she holds her own. She coolly takes stock of everyone and everything around her. These men with peach fuzz jawlines and bad attitudes do not impress her much. She thinks most of them talk too damn much and need to keep quiet. She's been in Pakalna only a few days when I meet her, and she's worked her way up north from Guatemala with a group of migrants and smugglers that she ran into at the border with Mexico. This group includes Chino and Santos, who are now working with a man that they call Shadow, who is transporting several Honduran women. Jessamine tags along after Chino promises her safe passage for at least a few hundred kilometers. It helps that she thinks he is good looking. Pakalna is supposed to be a pit stop on her way to the United States. Instead, she finds herself stranded there for almost a month, trying to raise enough money to continue on. She falls in with Chino, Santos, and others who are all waiting for the right moment to get moving again. And she takes no shit from anyone. She defies, in many ways, the simplistic stereotype of the vulnerable female migrant. She doesn't cower, she's not meek, but she's also not naive. She understands that the Migrant Trail is an especially difficult place for women who are subject to higher rates of assault, rape, kidnapping, sex trafficking, and murder compared with men. Rape at the hands of bandits, law enforcement, and smugglers is so pervasive during the migration process that some begin taking birth control pills before they start the journey. Given the higher risks that women face, many have developed gendered strategies for mitigating danger while en route. This can include performing the role of an overly feminine or chaste woman in need of protection, or overemphasizing personal toughness. One of the most common strategies is to travel with companions who can ostensibly provide physical protection. This male protective role can be played by a relative, a stranger, or a smuggler. In some cases, a female migrant and her male guide may take on the temporary roles of husband and wife, which can provide a cover story that helps them also enter migrant shelters. But Jesmyn does not need male protection. She made that clear many times to me. She goes with Chino because of a physical attraction that blossomed into a relationship. She doesn't need anybody's protection. And in the book, I go into great details about her backstory. One more story. Chino and Jesmyn are looking rough. She's been wearing the same clothes for several days, and the dark circles under her eyes signal restless nights of sleeping on a concrete patio just a few feet from the train tracks. A melody of chirping birds fills the jungle air, and Pakalna is weirdly peaceful at the moment, except when the nearby train thunderously clanks as it adds new boxcars in preparation for departure. Chino is both talkative and more relaxed than normal. He's not nervously pacing or taking enthusiastic slugs from a plastic jug of Kanya, rot gut that folks drink. Even the fingers on his machete-ravaged arm that are normally twitching have seemed to have found some sense of stillness. It appears that something has happened with Chino, and he's changing. He's starting to contemplate a different kind of life in Mexico, and one that now seems to include Jesmyn. I might stay in Pakalna, he tells me. We're thinking about renting a room, or maybe heading to Guatemala. This statement catches me off guard, because weeks earlier he was running around the tracks shit-faced, talking about drinking bleach as a way to escape his troubled life. And now he's found some optimism about the future. The two of them are clearly smitten with each other, love at first sight on the Migrant Trail. As we sit and talk about his future, I wonder if this is how he gets out, if this is how he's going to escape this life. Can it be this easy? And let's hear from him directly. So this is an outtake from a documentary that we put out in 2019 called Border South.
Pues la primera vez que me vine para acá fue por amigos, pues, que lo dicen a uno, vamos allá, que bla, bla, bla. Que está bien por acá y la mera neta, pues también está cabrón. Por todos lados. Con esto es un disparo y un machetazo con machete. Uno quiere superar ya más.
¿Y ahora cuáles son tus planes para el futuro entonces?
Tratar de conquistar el mundo, como decimos, ¿no?
¿Qué vas a hacer cuando lo conquistes?
Ya estabilizarme. No, está difícil, pues. Pues como anda en otro lugar, la verdad uno no puede decir qué es lo que va a suceder, sino que lo que Dios disponga, pues. Lo que Dios diga, eso es lo que va a suceder, porque no se sabe, pues. No se sabe.
We decided to throw a party at the end of my field season on the train tracks. We get a bunch of beers, cake, we sit around, listen to some music. Chino tells bad jokes, and Jesmyn laughs at them. Everything is feeling momentarily good and optimistic. But a couple of hours into this party, he pulls me aside and he says something has happened. They've had problems now with Sombra, the smuggler who they had traveled with previously. He tells me Sombra and Santos got ready to go yesterday, and they were asking Jesmyn about if she was ready. They were telling her to get her bags so we were going to go. He says, but Sombra knew that I liked Jesmyn, And so he asked me if I was going to pay for her fees. I told him that we were going to stay, he says. And he got pissed. He said he would kill me if I didn't do as he says. But I told him I didn't want to go. I just didn't want to do it. And I said, if you had left with Sombra, what would have happened? He says, he's two-faced. You got to understand that, Jason. Those girls he is traveling with are worth a lot of money. He's going to get them across the border for free. He says he's going to get them across the border for free, but he's tricking them. They don't understand what is really happening. He says he's going to help them, but he's actually bringing them to a brothel so that he can sell them. Sombra got mad because he knew what I was up to. I knew what he was up to. He got pissed at me when I said I wasn't going to help him. I said, how could you do this to your own people? I couldn't go along with it. I said, but it's dangerous, right, to disobey an order. He says, yeah, because now they will come after me. That's why I have to get out of this place. Gang law says that since I disobeyed orders, I can't be here. And now I'm worried that they're going to come after me. And as he says, as he looks around at all of the various characters that are lurking in the background. He says, I'm still young and I want to get my life together. He says, I tell Jessamine, let's get out of here and fight for a better future. I said, he says, I told her, I don't care where we go. It doesn't matter. I don't care if I'm even just making $5 a day. But for me to leave this life, I have to get off the tracks. I can't be here because that's where they are. And if they see me, they're going to kill me. I said, what do you want to do? He says, I need help getting out of here. He said, there's a church in Palenque where I might be able to go and find some help. Can you take me? So we get in the car. The windows are rolled down to let the hot jungle air pass through the car. The sun is beginning to disappear to the west as Jason Isbell plays on the car stereo. In the side mirror, I can see Jessamyn's head leaning out the car window, her dark curly hair floating in the wind as she takes in the sights between Pacalna and Palenque. We take in signs that are advertising discount rates for hotels that have swimming pools and Wi-Fi. Hand-painted billboards that offer private tours of the nearby archaeological site. We pass an immigration van with the weary faces of migrants staring back at us through the vehicle's barred windows. I wonder if it's safer in that detention van than it is out here on the streets. I contemplate my own options for helping Chino. Do I bring him to my house? Do I drive him to some other town and rent him a room? How far is far enough for him to be safe from Sombra and his people, Shadow and his people? Do I just shove money at him and hope he can figure it out? We drive endlessly through the narrow cobblestone streets of Palenque, looking for a place that will take in migrants. Chino is indecisive and doesn't want to get out of the car. We find a church that has a few homeless people lingering outside. They tell us the priest is not in right now, but to come back later and maybe he will let them stay. We pass Palenque's central plaza. Couples the same age as Jessamyn and Chino embrace under brilliant white gazebos. Children devour melting ice cream and chase pigeons across the square. An out-of-tune brass band stumbles through a song from a distant decade. Chino nudges Jessamyn and points as we drive past. I told you Palenque was beautiful, he says. Because Palenque and Pacalna are only 6 kilometers apart, and they could not be, it's literally the other side of the tracks. And so most migrants will never know this other place that's so close. We can't find a place to drop him off. Defeated, we start heading back to Pakalna, back to the train tracks and the fate that is waiting for these star-crossed lovers. And for the rest of my life, I'll wish that I'd gone in the opposite direction and never taken my foot off the gas. Thank you.
Now we'll take questions. We have another half hour for Q&A.
Jason, thank you so much for your talk. This is a quite dramatic ending. So I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit more about what you meant. But my question, the question I was thinking of asking you was whether you could just tell us a little bit more about, I believe you said it was 10 years of working on this, or I don't know how many of those years were in the field in Honduras, in Mexico. If you could just tell us a little bit more about what that experience was like.
Sure. You know, the project began in 2015 in Chiapas, and then I was going kind of back and forth from here to there. I ended up having a sabbatical year, and so we spent most of that year in Mexico City. And then after that was just traveling as much as I possibly could to be both to Honduras and to Mexico. You know, one of the things that I really one of the things I did not do in this whole project was travel with folks. And so if I would like, I'm in Palenque or I'm in Pakalna, I'm with the group of smugglers. I'm not interviewing any migrants in this instance. I mean, a lot of times people were sort of like if we were in a safe house, migrants were in a different room. Smugglers are kind of doing their own thing, and so I tended to not interview migrants, partly because did not want to put them into a position where they have to say something about the people who they're kind of in their charge that could get them into trouble. And so you know, the migrants that I interview in the book, it's usually after they've already been smuggled. And then, you know, like something that would happen would be we're in Pakalna, we're hanging out for a few days, and then a smuggler would say we're going to be in, you know, in Veracruz in a week. And so I said, okay, you know, call me in a week and then I will come there. And so I was never, you know, I never got into a car with anybody. I never got on top of a train. So it was like, and because this is such low level smuggling, they tend to move pretty slowly because you're waiting for someone to wire a new round of money to pay whatever bribes or fees. And so, you know, this process could be weeks or months long getting across, and which actually made it really help facilitate the work because I could spend 5 days in one place interviewing folks, you know, about this thing, and then 3 days later I would see them in another place. But I ended up going back and forth, and then with the Honduras stuff, you know, that I was going there to interview either smugglers after they'd gone back, or I was interviewing their family members. You know, Jasmine, I interview her. I spent a lot of time with her in Honduras after a failed kind of crossing attempt. So it ended up being really multi-sided. Yeah.
Question?
Thank you so much for being here, Professor, and for your talk. I am a huge admirer of your first book, and I'm about a quarter of the way through this one, and I'm really looking forward to finish it. So much of your work deals with or you encounter humanity and also death so much throughout this work, throughout your previous book, throughout this book. And I guess my first question is like the work that you do is so viscerally important, and the work that you're doing to bring awareness to all of these things that are happening is so important, but I can only imagine how draining it is. So I wonder, like, given the important nature of this work, what do you do to recalibrate yourself and take care of yourself so that you can continue to do this work. That I think we are so lucky to be able to witness.
Thank you. Oh, and before I go, Larry, I don't want to ruin the story for people who haven't read the book, so that's why I stopped at that spot. So I feel like people get mad at me if I go into detail. So that's why it's the dramatic ending, and hopefully people will want to read the rest of the book. This question is really, it's an important one about like the recalibration. This work, like I didn't intend to do it. I wasn't like I didn't think, oh, this is my thing. I kind of fell into it. And it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. When the year we spent in Mexico, I would spend all night in a safe house, and then I'd come home in the morning and have to like sit down with a toddler at breakfast and be like, well, how was last night, Dad? And you're like, oh, well, someone just told me all about like people that they've killed. It's like, it was this thing that, and I ended up, there was murder comes up a lot in this book, and it was never something I asked about directly, but a lot of folks looked at me as like a therapist because no one had ever listened to them. And I think in this kind of way. And so they wanted to share a lot of things with me, even though I was like, I am wholly unprepared to take on these things. And the thing that this book did for me, it sent me back to therapy after like a 20-year hiatus. I had kind of a brutal childhood and was in therapy a little bit as a kid, then kind of stepped away from it. Graduate school sent me back to therapy, but not good therapy. And so I went back to therapy, and then I found it to be a very frustrating kind of experience. And so I said, I'm fine. I'm totally fine. I don't need this anymore. And then in the writing of this book, became super clear that I was not fine in a lot of ways. And I ended up going back to therapy during the writing process. The writing itself became pretty therapeutic, I think. And I think it's weird to say this, but spending all this time in this kind of darkness, I feel like I'm the best that I've ever been in my personal life after this kind of horribleness. I didn't think I would come out of this and learn something about myself, and it was a thing that happened. But also, I don't know if I have this in me anymore. I feel like this might be. Definitely for now, I'm working on like a project on guitar distortion pedals. I'm doing other stuff right now that's like just to help me be not in this place. But as people have joked to me, they said, well, even with that, I'm sure you'll find some dark corner of guitar pedals that you can write about. So it's like, that's whatever that says about me. But it was, when I went into the field, I wasn't trained as an ethnographer, right? I was an archaeologist, and then I sort of reinvented myself largely when I was here at the University of Michigan. And I didn't really know what to do, like how to do ethnography, how to sort of teach myself how to do it. I started reading it, and when you read ethnography, it's not helpful for methods, right? There's no methods section. And people are like, oh, and then I was there for a year and talked to people. Well, it's like, well, what actually happened there? How did you deal with it? No one ever talked about the difficulty of transitioning back from the field, or the many horrible things that you will see, even if you're not looking at those things, in the field. And so I had to kind of figure out for myself as I was doing it, kind of best practices. And it really began with the first book, where people would ask me, say, well, how do you kind of do this work? And I used to joke, I say, oh, well, that's what beer's for, and I was convincing myself too that the more I did it, I was creating this like callus that I could just, now I'm impervious to all this stuff. And what I have found has been the complete opposite, is that I'm way more sensitive about all these kind of things now. But I wish someone in the beginning had said to me, hey, fieldwork is brutal, and you need to talk to people, and you need to be like, you need to recognize these things in yourself. And it partly came out of I was having a talk with Philippe Bourgois, who's my colleague, and he was talking about just the like nightmares, and the like waking up in a cold sweat and just having some flashback. And I remember thinking to myself, like, well, that'll never happen to me. And then when it started happening to me, I was like, there's just like, I got to talk to somebody. This is not normal. And I do think like we don't teach ethnographic methods enough in general. And then when we do it, it's oftentimes not talking about that kind of difficult subject matter and admitting that we need to find ways to help ourselves, to be kind to ourselves. And so I think in some ways, I say a lot of that out loud in this book because I needed to say it for myself, but I also hope that people will read it and go like, oh, it is okay to talk about these things, and with the hope that we can learn better practices for doing it.
You want me to pass it? I just have a question. Like the pictures, a lot of thought went into the pictures for this presentation. I think a lot about images these days because I've been avoiding the news because when I see pictures from Gaza, I can't sleep. You didn't show, I guess they're mostly your own pictures.
Yep.
Do you have any theorization of how you take them, how you choose to show them or not show them?
So this project began, it was supposed to be a photo ethnography on smuggling. And part of it was supposed to be me theorizing about what it means to be an ethnographer making images. And that was partly because I think there aren't a lot of good photo ethnographies out there. There are good ethnographies that have good photos in them, but a lot of times no one is commenting on the images themselves. They're just kind of there as this thing. And I think part of it is some of our best anthropologists who are taking pictures are people who were trained as photojournalists. And so they weren't, when you're learning photography, oftentimes you don't have all the baggage that like an anthropologist has. And so when I started taking pictures in 2015, I didn't know I didn't know anything about ISO or shutter speed, any of these kind of things. But when I was taking community college courses at Washtenaw, I was asking all these weird questions about well, what if your camera is racist, right? These kind of things what do you mean? I'm like, well, if the iPhone is not calibrated oftentimes to take a picture of a couple, if one has lighter skin than darker skin than the other, it doesn't know how to, it gets mad. And so I was asking these kind of technological questions with this cultural reference point. And my poor instructor was just like, oh my God, you're the most annoying student in the room. Stop asking these questions. But I became super interested in that. And that had been the intent with this book, it was going to have 150 images. It was going to have a bunch of essays of me theorizing about this kind of stuff. And then my agent was like, that's not this, there's this other story I think that you should tell first and then come back to that. So I've been writing about photography as an ethnographic practices in other places and kind of smaller places. And then the companion piece to this will be a lot of the images, but then really thinking about, the technology, the kind of praxis of image making, because I just don't think that there's not, I think we're having a moment right now within anthropology where the still photography is coming back. But we really haven't had enough discussions about what does it mean? How are our technological decisions shaped by culture, right? And just for an example, when I teach photography to students, I say, look, if you're having trouble taking pictures of strangers, which is basically what this this is how this all starts. So, think about the difference between taking a picture of someone with an iPhone versus a Fuji Instant camera. You take a picture with the instant camera and that image pops out, and you hand it to that person, that immediately changes that dynamic in a lot of ways compared to doing with an image. And that was often a good way for my students to start thinking about, these technological decisions shape these encounters in so many different ways. But that's kind of what I'm hoping to get into next. We shot, Mike and I, it was a completely analog project, for good or for bad. And we shot about 12,000 images, and we've only published maybe 10. So this is I'm hoping this summer to kind of dig in a little bit.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Speaking of ethnographic methods, I was wondering when you initially approach people like Gino and Jasmine, how do you set up your project? What do you tell them about what you're trying to do and why you're interviewing them?
The hardest thing is explaining to people what an anthropologist is. Because they're like, I don't understand, and you're like you're like a teacher, or are you a journalist? And it's like, okay, I'm a journalist who's going to be way more annoying because I will be here for a long time. You'll get real sick of me. But I think with this project, I had just finished the first book, and so I actually had a book I could walk around and go, look, I did this thing. believe me, talking to migrants and with the smugglers, what ended up happening, we were in Mexico. I had a group of students with me, a bunch from University of Michigan, including one that's here in this room. And, it wasn't like the safest place to be out on the train tracks. So I could put students in this migrant shelter where it was sort of a, enclosed space. They're working with these nuns and they were basically helping folks in different ways. And the nuns who ran the shelter kept saying to me, whatever you do, don't go outside. Like there's lots of riffraff out there. It's going to be, you're going to get in trouble, blah, blah, blah. They're going to rob you. And I kept thinking to myself like, oh, riffraff, that seems interesting, So literally, it took about 20 minutes to get into this project. I walked outside, I'm on the train tracks. I hear a bunch of like reggaeton music being played. I see a huge cloud of marijuana smoke. I walk over and I'm like, hey, how's it going, guys? I'm an anthropologist. And start talking to them and they're like, and I kind of explained to, they figure out I'm not a cop. And they figure out that I have no problems buying food and beer. And so they're like, okay, have a seat. And then one of them just says to me, no one ever talks to us. No one ever wants to know our story. Why don't you get your little recorder out and talk to me about this whole thing? And I said, okay. And we just kind of sat down and that's how it started. And then afterwards, I spent years with these folks, and it was always interesting how they introduced me to, like, they'd be like, this is my chronicler, or this is my professor who that, but once they kind of figured out the whole thing, then, so many just doors opened. But I think the thing about ethnography, I think all ethnographers will tell you this, is that the first time you do field work, it's really hard. And then when you come back on that second trip, so much changes because people go, oh, you weren't lying. You actually did come back, right? And then now suddenly you've earned some trust in a new kind of way. And for me, just going back every day on the train tracks just kind of made people, get like, oh, wait, well, he's not going to go away anytime soon. So we might as well, either tell him to piss off, or, he has a birthday cake with him or whatever I'm carrying at the time. Like he's got a bag of ribs. Well, he's entertaining. And that was the other thing too, is smuggling. It's a lot of downtime. It's like super boring. And so we spent so much time listening to music, drinking beer, just like telling stupid jokes. And I'm like, I'm really good at those things. And so this was like a perfect thing. We weren't in motion very much. But I think people just liked the fact that I was willing to sit around and do anything and do nothing. And, that video I showed when the director, Raul, came the first time to Mexico to do this, we were out on the tracks, and we spent all day just like sitting on the tracks, just kind of, drinking beer, listening to music, telling stupid jokes. And he's like, when are you going to start doing some work? When am I going to get my camera out? And I said, what are you talking about? I've been working all day, man. This is like hard work. And I said, like, you have to figure out, these guys have to figure out who you are before you can pull his camera out. And, of course, he's on a different kind of time schedule. And so, but then once he kind of realizes, like, oh, this is like the long haul. Like, you're just here. He started to understand that. And the same thing with the folks that I work with, they got it, that, like, this was going to be a very, some of them are probably like, finally, this thing came out, but it takes a while.
More questions? Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for that gripping, generative talk. I'll be thinking about it for a long time. There's something about this book and this work that reminds me of a special issue and a talk that Samantha Pinto and Jennifer Nash gave about bad objects. Particularly bad objects in feminism, or generally that academic study, like pornography, or maybe like Black conservatism, right? These really uneasy so-called bad objects, or like extra legal kind of things. And it made me think about how smuggling could maybe be considered a kind of so-called bad object. And I'm just curious if, since this is your first of what will be hundreds of talks, maybe we could practice thinking together about how you plan to engage various audiences about this so-called bad object and present it as like a generative, productive space to be thinking about like humanity, to be thinking about like ambivalence, to be thinking about like multiple things happening at the same time. I'm really fascinated on how you plan to like engage the so-called bad object as something that is like really, really epistemologically, methodologically, really important and important for the social sciences and the humanities. I wonder if we can think together about that.
You know, that's a great question. That's one that often keeps me up at night, especially in the beginning of this project. And I remember I gave a talk about some of this work a while back, and afterwards someone came up to me and said, I didn't like that talk you just gave. And I said, oh, why is that? And I said, it just made me feel weird. And, you know, and I said, it's okay to feel weird. I feel weird about this too, you know? And she said, she's like, I didn't like it because it made me feel sorry for people that I don't want to feel sorry for. And then I said, it's okay to have complex feelings. You know, the world is a complex place. And, you know, I think maybe the job of the anthropologist, I mean, right, we overly complicate everything, right? This is why people ask me, like policymakers, I go, well, tell me how, like immigration reform. And you go, okay, let me draw world systems theory first. Or like, you know, just, and then they're like, oh no, like that's not a campaign slogan, you know? And I think that just because subject matter is uncomfortable or difficult doesn't mean that's more of a reason why we need to do it, right? We need to understand, because this is what life looks like. And something like smuggling, I mean, it's happening globally all the time. It's this huge part of this thing. And I really, it's like, you know, I didn't want to, and I knew if I honed in on something that made me so uncomfortable, it would force me to think about it differently. And so that was kind of on purpose. I was trying to get out of my comfort zone. And I was hoping that it would make me engage with it in a different kind of way. But I do think that we need more social science research. I mean, if it was, you know, and I have this issue too, like when my students come in, they say, oh, well, you know, I want to work at the US-Mexico border, you know, in the desert. And I go, well, what are you going to do there? There's a million people that we kind of know that story right now. And so if you're gonna be in that context, you've got to have a new kind of question and ask a different something that we don't quite know yet. And that might be just a really difficult one, but those are the ones I think that can be the most generative. And really, you know, this is smuggling is in the title of the book, but this book is, you know, it's partly about capitalism. It's about climate change. It's about all these, you know, and I think about the difficult subject matter in some ways is like with like, my wife is very good at, you know, my kids and I none of us want to eat vegetables. And so she just like sneaks them into the sauce, you know, and I'm like, this is really good. And I'm like, you know, and part of this book is like, you know, people will go, oh, smuggling, that sounds so salacious, you know, and then but then trying to give them something else that then you walk away going like, oh, like, what am I supposed to do with that now? You know, and now I don't know how to feel about it. Like, well, at least you're feeling something, right? At least you're thinking about it. And, so that's the goal, I hope. Yeah. Thank you.
Any more question?
Jason, that was a really great presentation. Thank you. So I wanted to ask you a couple of things about now the afterlife of the project and of the research, and particularly having written this book that's a trade book, as you described it. So I was first wondering if you're working on a Spanish edition and how you're kind of thinking about the way the book is going to circulate in the other America that you've written about, and particularly what the people you wrote about might think about the book as well, if they're going to read the book, you think. So I was curious about that, but I was also thinking about the way you and many other ethnographers are now interested in writing and in the whole question of ethnographic writing and writing for a general audience. That was something that was really stigmatized when I was a grad student. You know, people talked about Margaret Mead and described her as a popularizer, you know, because she was readable, and many other writers of that generation who are writing for a general audience. But now anthropologists are very interested in writing, and we have several books about anthropology and writing well. You know, Alive in the Writing is a book by Kiran Narayan, and well, many, many others. So I think it's really interesting now that we've moved into this stage of thinking about ourselves as writers. So I wondered if you could talk more about that, about your role now. You did this incredible research, but you also became this incredible writer. So, it was great that you talked about the photography, but I also wonder about your role as writer and what that's going to mean now that this book is out and circulating in the world.
And Ruth has to say nice stuff because she blurbed the book. Right? So, but thank you for those questions. We are working on Spanish rights right now. I mean, one of the big travesties to me is that Land of Open Graves is not in Spanish. It's in complex and simple Mandarin, but it's not in Spanish. And when I've gone to the press and said, and they're like, well, you should go find a good translator and a good press to produce this. And I go, well, is that my job to do that? And so we're hoping with this one that there will be interest in a Spanish market, and I'm hoping with that there will be interest in translating that first book, because I do think it's really important to be able to engage with those audiences, both the sort of popular reader as well as researchers who are working in the region. And partly for me, it's just to have more representation about what's going on in Honduras. I feel like Honduras is so undervalued in the kind of history of Central America, and people you sort of lump like, oh, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, it's all kind of the same, right? And have radically different political histories, and that's one of the reasons, like, a lot of my students now, I've really encouraged them to work in Honduras, because I just feel like there's so much that needs to be done there. But it would be really, so we're fingers crossed that we'll have some Spanish translations by the end of the year, at least getting started. And then I think with the folks who are in it, some of them will read it and be interested in it. Someone like Jasmine, I think, would definitely, she's interested in the project and kind of knows all about different elements of it. But there's other folks who, the only thing that they want is make sure their pictures in there, or like they're just make funny jokes about stuff. But everybody will get this copy, the English copy, and then the Spanish version. Because even with the first book, like the person that I call Memo in my first book, he's got like a second grade education, so he's not very literate. But the book for him is so important to just walk, because his pictures are in it, and so he can walk around and show it. It's like such a meaningful thing for him to kind of have. In terms of the writing, it feels like we are in this moment. And I remember, 10, 15 years ago, people would call me, oh, you're an engaged anthropologist or a public anthropologist. But it wasn't a thing that wasn't said to me in a way that it was like good, right? It was like, oh, you do this other thing. And I always thought it was funny that, like, if I'm a public anthropologist, what's the opposite of that, right? Like, what's the point of comparison? I think one of the things that's happened is the academy, especially the administration in different universities, I think recognize the good press that they get when we're doing kind of more public engaged kinds of things. And I feel like, the AAA's has a whole new statement on how to evaluate public-facing scholarship and different forms of it. UCLA I was on a task force there about how to judge that for tenure reviews. Like, how do you make sense? An exhibition or documentary film? How do we evaluate that as part of the dossier? And so I think that's the administrations are very interested in that, and that's helping that along. But I also think that the writing, there's a bunch of books coming out or that are already out right now, written by anthropologists who who are trying to write for broader audiences. And for me, it was never on purpose. Like, I hated writing. I think graduate school made me hate writing and made me hate reading. Because when you're in graduate school, most of the time you're not reading things that are good, right? You read some like French theory and you're like, this sentence is 4 pages long. It literally, it keeps going, and so I think what happened to me was when I had to work on the book, and I was never anticipating writing a book. And then when the powers that be said, if you want to get tenure, you need to write a book. And then I was like, well, I hate writing an 8,000 word article. How am I going to write a 100,000 word book? I had to sit down and go, okay, well, the only way that I'm going to be able to do this is if I do it kind of on my own terms. And then I reminded myself that, like, oh, you used to love to read fiction, and I used to love to write. I was in bands for so many years, and I was like, my favorite bands are you know, or singer-songwriters who can put word to paper and like, you know, like Bruce Springsteen can write 3 lines and just break my heart kind of thing. And so I was like, oh, I used to like doing that too. Maybe I can figure out a way to kind of do that, to write for a way that makes me feel good about the process. And it was, I don't know where it was, but I just read something about being kind to your reader. I thought to myself, when I was I got no writing advice in graduate school. I mean, at all. And if someone had just said to me, you should be kind to your reader, you should make them want to like keep going. Once I thought about that, I was like, oh, that's a novel idea. Let's see what that looks like. And I went from totally hating the writing process to then doing it and being like, oh, this is like all I want to do. And for me, like the biggest part of writing are like, it's like long walks, so much music that I'm just playing, trying to kind of get in the right headspace, and then just reading and just read, you know, I read something and go, I want to do this, you know, this, you know, author, I mean, she's breaking my heart with like just a bunch of words together. How is that even humanly possible? And then going, okay, like, let's see if we can replicate that. But I wish that had been an early, you know, if someone early on said, hey, whatever you do, just be kind to your reader, right? Just get your point across in a way that makes them want to get to the finish line. And that realization for me really helped with the whole process. And now, you know, I mean, I'm not gonna, I can't go back to however I was, you know, trying to write before. And I think if you look at my writing between probably 2012 and when the book came out, you see it kind of slowly evolving with me trying to experiment and figure out where I'm at. But I feel like I've gotten to a point now where I couldn't write like I did in graduate school. I mean, I just wouldn't be able to do it. But it's been a kind of super organic process for me, and you know, I love it. I mean, it's such a wonderful. I mean, as you know, I mean, writing is just like this thing it makes it all kind of worth it. Except now I'm just mostly writing emails. But it's my least favorite writing genre. Yeah.
I know it's a little after 5:30, and I also know there are a few questions. We can continue our conversation outside with some food, but please join me in thanking Professor Jason de León and everyone online. Thank you so much for being a part of it.